Hello and a warm welcome to our podcast on rogue states in the nuclear discourse. This is my lovely colleague Iskra Alikalfic and my name is Gabriela Maier Tolic. We are both studying international relations at Charles University, and this is our final year of our studies. This podcast is a project for our class Politics on Nuclear Non-Proliferation, which is taught by Professor Smetana. And we will now discuss the concept of rogue states in the context of nuclear non-proliferation. And Iskra will start by explaining the origin of the concept of rogue states.
Hi, everyone. So the concept of rogue states actually originated in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War in the US. And it identifies rogue states as seeking to obtain weapons of mass destruction and support terrorism and severely abuse its own citizens. So a lot of violations of human rights. And the United States employed actually several tools to isolate and punish rogue states, such as, for example, in Libya, they employed a regime reconstruction. And it was actually first used by the US National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, who labeled 5 nations as rogue states, which were North Korea, Cuba, Iran, Libya, and Iraq. And he described these regimes as outlaw states that not only choose to remain outside the family of democratic nations, but also assault its basic values. So this placed a lot of emphasis on the different types of regimes between the US and the rogue states being very authoritarian, and the US being the example for democracy. And the term outlaw states is a synonym of rogue states and is actually a term applied by a lot of international theorists to states that are considered to threatening world peace. And this term rogue states has been widely used over time. And even recently, the prior president of the United States, Donald Trump, has referred to the term. And it's important to keep in mind that how long this term was used and has been in nuclear discourse, especially, and how it affects the steps that these states and their partners take towards non-proliferation.
Yeah, so we can basically say, that rogue states are bad international citizens. There's also a few synonyms for it, as Iskra already mentioned, like outlaw states, renegade, which also means traitor or pariah. And yeah, I would say, there's one of the biggest turning points in the discourse on rogue states was definitely the Axis of Evil speech by President Bush in January 2002, which was shortly after the 9/11 attack. And obviously, this was a very hard time for the United States, and they had to, react to a lot of things in the world. But a lot of people say that the way the speech was held reframed and really deepened this term rogue states in a negative way. Before I go into a few of the quotes of that speech, and I also recommend that you would watch it. It's not that long and it's really good to watch it. But I just want to say that in terms of North Korea, this was actually like shortly before the speech, it was actually quite a promising time in the relationship between North Korea and the US. Because the Secretary of State for Clinton, which was Madeleine Albright, had a promising talk with Kim Jong-il, and he even made agreements that were really promising for the relationship, like promising to freeze all the production, deployment, and testing of all ballistic missiles with the range of 300 miles or more. And they were like, there was just this positive place in international relations between the countries. But after Bush's speech, where he basically placed North Korea within an axis of evil with Iran and Iraq, all this hope between the relationship of these countries had kind of vanished. And North Korea even, in Kim Jong-un went into hiding for 50 days because he was afraid that he would be assassinated. Etc. So it was quite interesting in that perspective, and also quite sad maybe to see how that promising relationship went in a different direction. yeah, for example, Bush said, North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. And in relation to Iran, he said, they have something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, aiming to threaten the peace of the world. And the United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons. So I would just really emphasize here again that in his speech, he was using terms like enemy, he was using terms like civilized versus uncivilized world, he was using sentences like states like these, and this really created a divide between two sides, like the rogue states and the civilized international community.
I believe this also has a lot of emphasis on the power that the US holds and how it certainly identifies certain players as allies and other players as not allies, and how they're viewed in the international community, which significantly affect the players' reactions and behaviors. And this also leads us into the in-group, out-group phenomenon, which was strongly identified as the phenomenon in which an out-group is perceived as being threatening to the members of an in-group. So the phenomenon often accompanies in-group favoritism, and it requires one to have an affinity towards their in-group. So in the sense that states form their identities based on traits that are not like the others. So we are not like them, we are the opposite traits, we possess this and this and this. And so it essentially creates a sort of identity for everyone. And in Werner, Wagner, and Orndeko's book, Deviance in International Relations, they actually mentioned that there's a sense in which societies, domestic and international both, exist by virtue of identification of the other. So rogue states were used and invented to serve this similar purpose, in the sense that they are the others, which help identify and strengthen the identity of the international community and big players such as the US. And when we're talking about this, we can also look at the power dynamics that are essentially in the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which is not really like any other treaty, in the sense that it doesn't place all the countries on an equal level, but the P5 and nuclear the P5 have a lot of power and a lot of say, and nuclear weapon states especially compared to non-nuclear weapon states. And there's a certain type of hierarchy that presents in the treaty itself. So if the non-proliferation norms and the discourse is presented on the basis of the non-proliferation treaty, we have to take into account that there's these power dynamics that impact the relationships between the state and also affect the identity that the states hold. Yeah,
and I mean, even in the book that Iskra mentioned, it is being said that after the end of the Cold War, the US just really needed a new outgroup or a new enemy, because that's what the Soviet Union was for such a long time. So it could even be asked, like, was this concept just invented so that the US could have this new outgroup? Obviously, it's not the only reason, but it's just an interesting question that we can think about. But yeah, in especially in terms of power, which Iskra already mentioned, I think it's important to even look at who decides who the outgroup is. Like, not like it's not going to be a very small and insignificant state, but more the powerful states. And in the book by Dr. Smetana on nuclear deviance, which talks about the stigma politics and rules of the non-proliferation game, just the factor that power plays is also mentioned, and that it's often the powerful actors who are stigmatizing other actors. And this is also just like a whole process with different sub-processes. For example, there's like the idea of, like, not even the idea, but the process of stigmatization. An actor is being stigmatized or marked to have a certain identity, and then that actor has to respond also, or usually does respond to that stigma, which I think really plays in to like a constructivist way of thinking, because constructivists say that actors do not live or do not exist independent of the international community, but they are part of an international community, and states will that like their identity in that community plays a significant role for their behavior as well. And one aspect from Dr. Smetana's book that I found quite interesting is just even stigmatization management. For example, when we look at the case of Iran, it has received the stigma of being a rogue state or rogue actor, but it also tried to justify its behavior by pointing out some of the US behavior, which was also against the rules of the non-proliferation regime. So there is kind of this stigma management process in which an actor will even try to get rid of that identity, or try to justify it in order to be part of the civilized society again.
I also think it's important to notice that there is this pressure from countries such as Iran to make sure to identify the reasons they did and why they did what they did, and towards the big powers as well, versus when the US does something similar that Iran claims, the US doesn't have that pressure because it's the major superpower in the international community. And I also think it's important to notice that a lot of scholars have a Western bias when talking about things like this. So of course it's totally a different perspective from someone who is from North Korea and is from Iran and has been living their life throughout all of this from the other side point of view. And I think it's important to take that into account.
Yeah.
So the next phenomenon that I will just mention that it's important to keep throughout the interview with Dr. Knopf especially is the self-fulfilling prophecy, which is also known as the Pygmalion effect, which explains the process by which one's expectations about someone can lead to someone behaving in ways that actually confirm those expectations. It's interesting to know that Mohammed Alavi, who is the Iranian intelligence minister, actually said that if a cat is cornered, it might not behave the same way as a free cat. So if Iran is pushed in that direction, then it wouldn't be Iran's fault, but those who pushed it. So through this quote, he essentially says that it's the US's and the international community's fault that pushed Iran to these actions that caused it to violate the JLPOA and push it towards this deviant behavior. So can we, with the perceptions and beliefs that the Western world has about Iran and North Korea as well, can we look at it as one of the reasons that they behave the way that they do? And does it reinforce their behavior, their deviant behavior?
Yeah, and even in Dr. Smetana's book, there is this quote saying, "The reflexive, self-fulfilling prophecy of treating someone as inherently morally flawed and the impossibility to fully get rid of a deviant identity leads an individual to eventually develop a deviant career and reenact the negative expectations of the normal society in his or her future behavior." So I think just even thinking about it, what we just already said, does the way others describe you to be really influence your future behavior? It's quite important.
Exactly. I think that the overall question that sums up this introductory part of the podcast is if the way that rogue states have been labeled, and if the way that what the international community really focuses on, the not essentially the commonalities between the two sides, but more the differences, and especially in regimes, does this provide the notion for their deviant behavior? And if the commonalities were more focused on, would it have provided a bigger basis for cooperation, especially in nuclear disarmament? And yeah, I think that's the essential question to keep in mind throughout the entire podcast. So now we'll be joined by an expert on nuclear weapons regime that I mentioned before, Dr. Jeffrey Knopf, who has agreed to assist us in finding the answers to these questions, and we are very thankful for his cooperation.
Now we are joined by Dr. Jeffrey Knopf, who is a professor and also the program chair of the Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. Let me just quickly introduce him as well a bit more. He has his bachelor's degree in social studies from Harvard University and also a master's and a PhD in political science from Stanford. And what we found really interesting was that you started your career researching non-proliferation and nuclear weapons based on your past activism and interest in stopping the nuclear arms race.
So we have some questions prepared for Dr. Knopf that we're going to ask. And I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us and answer everything that we're interested in.
Yes, well, you guys are quite welcome, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. I'll just start with the first question. Do you believe that rogue states, especially Iran, perceive themselves as enemies of the Western world?
Yeah, so let me start by letting you guys and your listeners know that I'm not a country expert or a regional expert. So I approach topics like Iran and North Korea partly through the lens of being a non-proliferation specialist and partly as somebody who has taught about and written about deterrence strategies and possibilities for updating and adapting deterrence to kind of post-Cold War scenarios. I'm not sure that I would use the word enemy as the best descriptor in this situation. So certainly both Iran and North Korea, they have hostile adversarial relationships with the United States and the West more generally. And I think although they're very different in some ways, I think some basic descriptors really fit both of them. So it's a little bit of a sort of two different things going on at the same time. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with the security dilemma, kind of basic term in international relations that when deciding whether or not to seek cooperation and peace with another country or to treat it as a threat and build up defenses against it, depends a little bit on the other country's intentions and motivations, right? Are they a country that is revisionist, expansionist, opportunistic in trying to take advantage to expand their influence, right? Or are they motivated more by insecurity and there's sort of a mutual misperception where each side sees the other side as an enemy and reacting to that. They sort of, have an action-reaction cycle that builds up, their hostilities. And I think for both Iran and North Korea, one of the things that makes them so tricky to deal with is that both these things are true. So that they're simultaneously insecure and greedy, if you will. So both countries have histories of bad past interactions with the West, right? In Iran, they will remember that outside powers, primarily the UK, but to some extent the United States as well, helped engineer a coup that overthrew the Mossadegh regime in the 1950s, replaced him with the Shah, who ruled in a very authoritarian way and was unpopular domestically, and that eventually sowed the seeds for Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution. Right, and in North Korea, you had the Korean War, which they started, but in the course of it, the United States pushed its troops north of the dividing line between South and North Korea and tried to essentially eliminate, North Korea as a country and reunify it from the South. So both Iran and North Korea, have reasons to be suspicious of the West based on these past memories. Right, and then these got really reinforced in recent decades, especially after 9/11, when President George W. Bush gave the famous speech where he described that there was an axis of evil that included Iraq, Iran, and North Korea by name. So he, the United States pretty much put them on notice that we were threatening them and that there was an ambition to bring about regime change in those countries and change the nature of their internal regimes. So on the one hand, they have real reasons for insecurity and viewing the West with a lot of suspicion and as a security threat. Right? But then you add to that they also have sort of internal, domestic drivers of their policy, right? They're both, I guess in Iran's case, we would probably say, authoritarian country, North Korea probably, all the way to totalitarian, but dictatorships that have to figure out how to maintain a base of support, how to legitimize themselves with their domestic populations, right? And in both cases, it is a good play for them to demonize the West and the United States and to tell their domestic populations, how evil and hostile Western countries are. So especially in Iran, they really play this up a lot since the revolution. They've referred to the United States as the Great Satan, right? And they organize sort of fake domestic rallies at home where they turn out the population to get out and scream slogans denouncing the United States and stuff. So they have real reasons to feel insecure and threatened by the West, right? And they also have domestic reasons to exaggerate this and heighten it and play it up and generate a sort of false, hostility towards the West to help legitimize themselves domestically. But you put those two things together, and yes, it makes for very bad, very unfriendly relationships.
Do you think that the fact that they're seen as the axis of evil and as irrational, especially their leaders, do you think this might will influence their future responses to non-proliferation and disarmament advocacy in general? Yeah,
I think it does. We should distinguish the two here because North Korea is obviously quite a bit more advanced, than Iran, right? North Korea has crossed the nuclear threshold, has probably a pretty substantial nuclear arsenal at this point, long-range delivery vehicles, probably the ability to actually strike the territory of the United States. Iran has a program, but they haven't yet, mastered nuclear explosive technology or delivery capabilities to actually, launch a nuclear weapon at somebody else. So they're still below the threshold, and North Korea passed it, long ago at this point. But yes, I think both countries have pretty good reasons not to want to give up, what they have, right? North Korea views its nuclear capabilities as a deterrent that it needs, partly because it perceives, the United States as hostile and preferring to change the nature of the regime, if possible. Partly because they got left in the dust by South Korea. South Korea has developed amazingly economically and become, a world economic power, and North Korea can't compete with them. So there's also the worry about just, will they collapse, if the population finds out how much better the South Koreans, have it. And then finally, the end of the Cold War really had a big impact on North Korea because they had been protected by having the Soviet Union, right, as an ally. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia doesn't care about North Korea nearly as much. So at this point, China is probably their only friend, right? And even China has a kind of mixed or ambivalent relationship with North Korea. So they feel really isolated, in the world right now. So I think they're pretty locked in to holding on to nuclear weapons, and it would take a pretty big transformation in world politics, to get them to change. Iran, I think, is still potentially in reach of being brought more completely into the existing global regime. And unfortunately, I have to say that the United States, blew it here. Right, we had the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. Most people just call it the Iran nuclear deal, that was negotiated by the Obama administration. Right, and then we had a change of administration. The Trump administration came in and they withdrew from the deal, increased sanctions and economic pressure on Iran. Right? And Iran responded to that by progressively taking more and more steps to break out of its side of the deal as well, and in particular to really start improving its enrichment of uranium to the point where it's really right on the threshold right now of having manufactured nuclear materials that could be used to build a bomb. So there's very active talks going on right now between Iran and its partners in the JCPOA, which is sometimes referred to as the P5+1, so United States, Britain, France, China, Russia, Germany. The EU participates in this. And the Biden administration is very interested in restoring the JCPOA. But a couple things have changed in Iran. They've moved a lot further along in their technology developments. It's going to be harder to kind of stuff them back in the box, right? And they also had an election, and they have a new president, Raisi, who's more hardline, more skeptical about the deal than his, predecessor was. So, if I lived in Las Vegas or one of the places in the United States where we have legalized gambling, and I was an odds maker setting odds, I would say it's probably not going to work. We probably can't get it back, but it's not impossible. It's still possible to imagine a path where Iran could still be brought into the fold.
Okay, I'd like to ask another question just about what you were saying earlier, the axis of evil speech, specifically in regards to the fact that Madeleine Albright was before that in quite a good place with North Korea. And I just wanted to ask whether you think that US foreign policy discourse has basically then shaped the identity of rogue states, specifically North Korea in this case. And yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. They have lots of internal drivers of their sort of identity, self-conception. So I wouldn't want to exaggerate the outside impact here. I don't think reacting to the rhetoric of the United States is the single number one biggest cause of how they see themselves. I had a former colleague who used to talk about the norm of norm defiance, right? That if we think of international politics from a social constructivist lens, where there are norms and actors with some identities embrace the norms, right? You could imagine also having an identity as a rogue, right? As a renegade, as defiant, and getting some of your self-image through kind of openly and ostentatiously defying the norms. And I think that's true a little bit of both Iran and North Korea. And in this case, I'd say probably North Korea to some extent more, than Iran. With Iran, the other, well, actually both of them are, this is true a little bit of both of them, but probably more Iran, is that they see themselves as kind of distinct and special. So in Iran's case, it's partly the memory of ancient Persian civilization, right, and always having been an important player in that region of the world, right. It's partly their identity as the first country in that region to embrace an explicitly Islamic style of government and to want to spread sort of their Islamic revolution through the region. So they are, I think, ambitious and to some extent revisionist, in a way that goes beyond North Korea. Like they really want to be the major player in their region, and it creates, a whole nother dynamic where they have this very intense rivalry with Saudi Arabia, who's sort of the rival for kind of regional power. And to some extent, that has nothing to do with the language that's been used by the West. That's sort of their own, internal conception of themselves. But then they get, when they get resistance because the United States remains active in that region and creates roadblocks to what Iran wants to do, right? That does add to their frustration. North Korea, they're revisionist in the sense that they would love to take over the South, moving from the North South, but they don't have ambitions beyond the Korean Peninsula. But they, from what I understand, with things like the Juche philosophy of self-reliance that they govern themselves by. They see themselves as, in some ways, a sort of more morally pure or good kind of nation and people compared to sort of the corrupt, outside world. So, it's a sort of an irony here that countries that view themselves as exceptional or special or having a mission in some way, all get into much more friction with each other. So, I mean, the United States is very much the same, where here in the United States, we talk about American exceptionalism, right? And the notion of what the Puritans, back at the origins of the country, called the city on a hill. That the United States has this special mission to be the leader of the free world and to spread, freedom and democracy around the world. So none of these countries is content to just sit at home inside their borders and be a normal country where we all want to be special, but we all want to be special in ways that are incompatible with each other. So that, in that sense, that does add to the frictions.
But maybe let me just add a follow-up on that too. I'm just wondering, specifically with those kinds of visions or ideas, are there any good ideas, like a weapon-free zone in the Middle East or something that we could build upon, that could be like our strategy to go away from this adversary position to partners for peace, and let's create good things in this world together.
Yeah. Well, I like where you're going with that question, which is, can we rethink our identities and our norms in a way that would promote more cooperative relationships, which I think is a valuable way to think about the dynamic. Let's just break out of the box that we're in right now and think in a new way. The window of opportunity for a WMD free zone in the Middle East, was probably also better in the past than it is today. The idea has been kicking around since at least, 1980s, 1990s. It was something that was promised as, one of the things that member states in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty would pursue as part of the agreement to extend the treaty indefinitely in 1995, when it was up for, potentially expiring. But it's, every time people try to get those talks going, they seem to collapse pretty quickly. And it's, I wouldn't single out any one player as being fully responsible for that, but probably the most reluctant country has been Israel, which has taken the position that, although it never officially acknowledges actually having nuclear weapons, hypothetically, they wouldn't want to give those weapons up, right, unless there was a broader peace agreement in the Middle East that made them feel secure that their existence would be recognized. And so they don't want to separate weapons from the larger peace process. And then that linkage has just always made things sort of fall apart, because WMD free zone is hard. Middle East peace is really, really hard. So getting to that as a precondition of a WMD free zone has always been a pretty big roadblock. I mean, I do, if I was advising the Israeli government, which I don't, that wouldn't be a bad play for them, in my opinion, right? If that was the way to make sure that Iran would roll back its nuclear program, and maybe Syria would get rid of the last vestiges of its chemical weapons program. That's not a bad outcome from Israel's point of view, but I think they just don't have enough trust in the other players in the region to do that.
Do you think that, I'm just going to ask a little bit more about Israel, but do you think that the rogue states, why does the US see the rogue states as more of a threat than Israel, who defies the whole transparency dilemma and everything?
So in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when the term rogue state became popular and started getting used a lot, there were some people who sort of said, well, let's define this term. What would be the indicators? 4 or 5 things that if you check these boxes, you're a rogue state. And Most of them kind of moved away from it again, because it turned out that almost any list you came up with would necessarily have to include both the United States and Israel, both of whom defy a lot of the norms that are supposed to exist. And of course, the people who like the words rogue state didn't want to include the United States and Israel. It just has to do with who has a history of friendly relations and a similar form of government. So, in the United States, we see Israel as a fellow democracy, in a region where most of the countries are not democratic, and as a country that has generally been, friendly towards and shared a lot of, interests with the United States. There's also a little bit of a domestic political dynamic. The evangelical Christian community in the United States, which is a really core voting bloc in the Republican Party, is very, very friendly and sympathetic to Israel for reasons of biblical, sort of text and prophecy. And so, historically, it used to be that there was more partisan difference, that the Democratic Party was fairly pro-Israel, but the Republicans were more pro-Arab. But with the rise of evangelical Christians as really the base of the Republican Party today, if anything, the Republicans might be more pro-Israel than the Democrats. They flipped, a little bit on their positions on that.
How do you think, in terms of changing the discourse and towards more cooperative action in nuclear non-proliferation, how do you think the new Biden administration will help in this, especially regarding U.S. foreign policy, obviously?
Yeah. I mean, they're going to help mostly because they're not the Trump administration. So, the Trump administration had mostly very negative effects, more so on Iran than North Korea. Like with Iran, the rhetoric was 100% hostile. They pulled out of the nuclear deal. They increased sanctions, right? And the Biden administration has made it very clear that if they can find a path to do it, they'd like to get back into the nuclear deal or into a renegotiated and updated nuclear deal. With North Korea, the Trump administration was much more puzzling, I guess we would say, right? It's sort of, they blew hot and cold. So you had this sort of scary period in Donald Trump's first year where they're, he's sending out nasty tweets about Kim Jong-un, and the North Koreans are insulting, President Trump right back. And they even had a scary incident in Hawaii where there was a false alert about a North Korean missile coming in, and everybody sort of panicked and ran for bomb shelters. But then they had a series of summit meetings that were in some ways very friendly and on an interpersonal level, they seemed to get along. And the Biden administration, they're not going to revive those summits and very effusively friendly comments about Kim Jong-un. So I think they're mostly just trying to ignore North Korea because they've got a lot of other issues they have to deal with and just hope it doesn't flare up. But the Biden administration will be positive in the sense that their vision is that they still support the notion of a rules-based international order, right? The world order that the United States in a lot of ways helped create after World War II. They still believe in that vision, and so, for example, next month they will finally hold the long delayed review conference of the NPT that was supposed to be held in 2020 before the pandemic hit. And I think the United States delegation there will try to be very constructive and do what they can to impart new momentum to the NPT and keep the treaty regime healthy. They've tried to re-engage Russia on nuclear arms control and strategic stability talks. So their body language is mostly in the right direction. The problem is that there's a lot of issues in the world that are creating frictions that make it hard to fully invest in that. I mean, the US-Russia relationship could completely collapse at any moment, depending on what happens in Ukraine. So, there's some things that are happening that are just outside the control of the Biden administration.
But like talking about the NPT specifically, one of the big issues is obviously the lack of disarmament right now. I think in your recent article, you were also mentioning it as like a possible fourth stand for like our nuclear regime, like alongside strategic stability, the nuclear taboo, and non-proliferation, and that you would see that as something that would impact the other strands positively. I was just wondering how how you see nuclear disarmament as maybe a stepping stone towards a nuclear-free world, or also maybe as a stepping stone towards being a good role model for rogue states, also not weapons or stop getting more.
Yep. Well, Gabriela, you've almost answered the question for me. So yes, a number of years ago, I wrote an article looking at the linkage between non-proliferation and disarmament. In legal terms, the linkage is written into the text of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, right? Article 6 of the NPT calls on the nuclear weapon states to make good faith efforts to end the arms race and move toward eventual nuclear abolition. The language is very vaguely worded, so there's no time-bound commitment about how to do this or any outline about the steps you have to take. It's just like, try one day to get there. But it's very clear that non-nuclear weapon states view this as a real and legally binding commitment. Like, you guys, the nuclear weapon states, you promised, you really have to do this. And all of the nuclear weapon states, but I think especially the United States, have gotten a lot of criticism over the years for the very slow rate, of progress in that direction, right? There was a period where things looked very good, when the Cold War ended. You had a series of successful nuclear arms control agreements between the United States and Russia that really did bring their numbers down quite a bit from the very high levels of the Cold War. But that process has, that's mostly stalled out, right? And the US, Russia, really all of the nuclear armed powers have been going through nuclear modernization processes where, even if they're not all increasing their numbers, right, they're making qualitative improvements. They're deploying new delivery systems, right? In the cases of at least China, India, and Pakistan, they're still adding to their numbers. And so if you think of the NPT using the language that a lot of people often use, that it was sort of a grand bargain, right? That, because it's a weird treaty, right? It's most of international law just treats all sovereign states the same, right? You could be a little tiny country, or you could be the most powerful country on earth, but in legal terms, you're equal, right? But the NPT is an unequal treaty, right? There's nuclear weapon states, 5 countries get to keep the bomb, and there's non-nuclear weapon states. There's nothing else, right, in between. And so 180 something countries have signed the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states, and they've promised they'll never get nuclear weapons. And to convince them to accept that inequality, right, they wanted something in return, from the nuclear weapon states. And so, Article 4 promised that they would have rights of access to peaceful uses of nuclear technology. And there's sometimes complaints about that. That's been a big issue with Iran, which keeps trying to pretend that everything it's doing is peaceful. They asked for, various kinds of security assurances that they wouldn't have their security threatened by nuclear weapons. Those are not in the NPT text, but there's been various side deals to try to do that. And they asked for this inequality not to be forever, right? This won't be a permanent condition. One day, we will use the NPT as a basis to move the world towards, global zero nuclear weapons. And I think they really do care about that, right? And they get angry, and they feel that the nuclear powers are not living up to their side of the bargain, and that it's reinforcing the inequality and unfairness of the treaty, if they don't make more progress towards disarmament. So, I'm going to be neutral about the vehicle for getting there. I know there's a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, right? And that might or might not turn out to be the right vehicle. But the nuclear weapon states, they absolutely have to do things to sort of revive their commitment to eventual nuclear disarmament and show that they really are taking that pledge seriously. right? And you know, the last 10 years has been sort of backsliding on the part of, I think, all of the nuclear weapon states, and that if that continues, right, it will unravel the NPT eventually. So, you know, if they care about maintaining the non-proliferation regime, you know, one of the best ways they can do that is to find some way to make a sincere and meaningful gesture towards wanting to move the needle forward on disarmament.
Do you believe that putting a time frame on disarmament in the NPT would be beneficial and something that would lead towards that?
I don't know that you could necessarily do it in the NPT because it's very hard to amend the treaty. Right. A number of people, including me in a sort of co-authored paper that's not published yet, have looked at 2045 as a desirable target date, because that would be the 100th anniversary of the invention of the bomb and the use of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I have a chapter that I co-authored with Michal Onderko, who you guys might know about, that was for a proposed handbook of international relations in the 22nd century, where we imagine it's 100 years from now, and we write the review essay about what's happening with nuclear weapons, and we did it as a sort of alternative histories, right? So one scenario in which things go really bad, there's a nuclear war, right? One scenario in which proliferation slows down and things stay stable, and one scenario in which there's actually disarmament. And in our fictional scenario, 2045 is the year that it's achieved. So yeah, I mean, symbolism can be really important, and I think something which has powerful symbolism like the 100th anniversary, it's far enough in the future that it's, you could imagine maybe actually making it by that date.
Yeah. Okay, I have one last question. We have one last question. Would you like to give an encouragement or advice to potential young activists, such as probably me and Gabby?
Good. Well, encouragement for sure.
Level zero world reality, especially with podcast and advocacy.
So, as you guys mentioned very early in my sort of life and career path in this field, I was an anti-nuclear weapons activist in the time period of the nuclear freeze movement, right, in the United States, and I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation trying to figure out what was the policy impact of these movements. Did activism make a difference? Was it just irrelevant? And I just looked at US, what the US did in the nuclear arms control field. And so the good news is I think I found conclusive evidence that these protest movements actually did make a difference, right? It's not that they got their demands, right? There was never a nuclear freeze proposed by the United States government, but they were pretty good at prodding administrations that were maybe reluctant to have nuclear arms control talks to sort of get back to the table, to start new rounds of talks, which eventually proved productive, in terms of at least producing some new treaties that created new restrictions. So, I would put it this way. Activist movements won't by themselves be sufficient to do this, but I think they're necessary, right? If the leaders of the world don't hear anything from their publics, right, and they don't feel any pressure on them from below, they have no incentive to do anything. So they need to hear from people that people still have concerns about the danger of nuclear war, right, and the desirability of moving to a nuclear-free world. So I do think that transnational social movements are just critical here.
But are there maybe people whom you protested with on the streets, and they're just not really involved at all anymore, and you're maybe still in contact with them? You know why they stopped advocating against?
I mean, the people I'm still in touch with are mostly people like me who sort of took our activism and advocacy more into either the NGO think tank world or the academic world, where we, it's been a long time since I went out and protested, but hopefully contribute by doing research that produces useful ideas, and by teaching younger people about the field and how to be effective advocates on their own. I mean, for many people, there was a moment when we thought the issue was really on a path to being solved, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, and there was a series of very good, arms reduction agreements, right? It looked like things were moving in a good direction and you didn't need to be pushing, people from below. That's stopped now. I would say the other issue is actually competing problems on the agenda. If I was a young person right now, I would probably be going to all the protests about climate change and global warming and really worrying about that. And, here in the United States, there's also still a lot of difficult issues around racism and race relations, gun violence. So there's so many things to be afraid of that nuclear war is sadly just one of many things that people can be preoccupied with. So, I hope people will also still pay attention to the nuclear issue because it's not solved, and if things go really wrong, it's really, really bad. But I don't blame people if they decide to prioritize climate issues or racial issues or survival of democracy, issues instead, because those are all looking pretty dire right now too.
Yeah. And we also really liked what you wrote in your article about learning, that a lot of our generation is not really aware of how it used to be, and just how that has to maybe be a pre-step before more activism can even happen in that area.
Yeah, and that's that would also be one of the things that young people could do on behalf of advocacy. So you can do the traditional, petitions and letter writing and protest marches and lobbying, government officials things. But public education is also a great, avenue to get into. When I was young, you just kind of learned about these things naturally because there were a lot of things in popular culture that addressed the nuclear issues. So movies that are very old now, like Dr. Strangelove or Failsafe or On the Beach, we just grew up watching those movies and learning about the danger of nuclear war from that. So, one of the things I've been trying to encourage is sort of figure out how to take advantage of new media platforms to reach a new audience. So I am noticing that there's more and more stuff starting to appear, on the web or on social media. But so far, nothing has had sort of the equivalent reach of a Dr. Strangelove. But if you or your friends came up with a way to alert and educate a whole new generation of people about nuclear dangers, that would be a big contribution.
I think it has a lot to do with what's current in the world, obviously, and like now with climate change and Black Lives Matter movements. I mean, it's something you see on a daily basis.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Cool. But thank you so much. I think we just ran out of time, so we weren't even able to address all the questions, but this was extremely insightful, and yeah.
Good. Well, thank you. And you guys asked great questions, and it was a pleasure to talk to both of you.
Too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.